Hey there. My name is Dr. Troy Catterson, and I'm a professor at Salve, Virginia University. In this particular video series, we are going to talk about the relationship between Christianity and economic life. And this particular video, we are going to talk about Christianity and communism. And we're going to answer the question that has been bandied about for many ages since the beginning of Marxism, and that is Christianity compatible with capitalism? And is Christianity compatible with communism? So often we have heard that the early Christian church was communist. And we often see in modern politics parties like the Christian Socialist or National Socialism, Christian National Socialism. I am going to argue that actually Christianity and communism are incompatible with each other in this video. So before I begin that, we actually have to define what we mean by communism. Because of course, communism has been defined in various ways. Marx himself defined it in different ways, depending on what work you're reading of his. We are going to boil it down to the question of private property. And so here is my definition of capitalism. Okay. So capitalism or communism is a governmental system that prohibits the ownership of private property. Now, the crucial part of the definition here is that this is a matter of law, that the government itself prohibits the ownership of private property in the form of capitalism. Okay. So, and what we mean by capital is just what Marx always meant by the means and sources of production or profit. Okay. So we could distinguish between two types of private property. I own a candy bar. You could say that that is not capital. I'm going to consume it. I'm not going to make money off of it, or I'm not going to use it to produce something else per se. So what we always mean by capital is the kind of property where I can grow the value of it and thereby earn a profit from it. So the question is Christianity compatible with that? And I'm going to argue that, first of all, it's incompatible with the biblical definition of private ownership or capital. Again, let me lay my cards on the table. When we talk about Christianity, of course, there are many forms, but we could say that the orthodox forms of Christianity are those that all affirm the Bible as the basic standard of revelation. And so we are just going to be looking at what the biblical teaching is on private property. And I am saying that the biblical standard assumes private ownership of capital. Why is this the case? Well, if we take a look at the central portion of the biblical standard of justice, which is in the Old Testament Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, in Exodus chapter 20, we see that there's an interesting commandment, and that is the commandment, thou shalt not steal, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15. And what does stealing mean? Well, stealing means that you are taking someone else's property without their permission. Of course, that assumes that there's an owner of that property. It's not you, it's someone else, and therefore that there's private ownership. Now, you might say, yeah, but how do we know that's not just the chocolate that I'm going to consume? How do we know that what the Bible is assuming here is private capital? Well, that's where we go to the 10th commandment. And in the 10th commandment, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, nor his ox, nor his ass, or donkey, in other words. And this is very important because we have to understand that the commandment is given to a society whose main means of production is shepherding, cattle herding, and farming, agricultural economy. And thus, all of these are ancient forms of capital. And Therefore, the commandment assumes that your neighbor, the individual person who's by you, who lives next to you, owns capital. We might say that this is assumed even in the way in which the Commonwealth of ancient Israel was set up by Moses. There we see that the land was divided not among government entities, but among tribes. And then the tribe divided the land among families, and these families own this land in perpetuity. And even when, for example, the land was sold off because of debt or something like this, the biblical standard had an interesting thing called the year of Jubilee, where all land reverted back to the original owners. And so private property was, in the form of capital and land, was distributed to private families and was assumed to be owned by that family in perpetuity. So we see that the biblical standard of justice assumes, as its very nature, that we owe our neighbor their capital and that that capital is not publicly owned. Not only is this the standard of justice, justice is just what I owe my neighbor, okay, and therefore what I'm forced to give them. But the biblical standard of morality, okay, the New Testament standard of virtue requires private property. The supreme Christian virtue is the virtue of love. And I'm going to argue that this requires private property also. Well, why is that the case? Well, you might say that the centerpiece of love is giving, isn't it? And not just giving in the sense of, okay, I took something from you and then I owe it to you, but rather the kind of giving that is sacrificial, that we would say is above and beyond. We call this kind of giving generosity. And generosity assumes, okay, this central characteristic, generosity assumes that there is private property. In what way? Well, first of all, you cannot give what is not yours. Okay, so let's look at a couple of New Testament passages to show this. First of all, we can look in the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, you might say this is the central teaching of Jesus and what it means to be a good person in the kingdom of God. Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount. It is the Christian standard of righteousness, of what it means to be a good person. And there Jesus commands us and says, do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. In the context, okay, it is talking about how in at the time, the assumption was that you give to people exactly what they deserve and justice is all that you do. And then Jesus says, no, do not turn away from him. Give to him who wants from you, who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. In other words, be generous. But the interesting thing is the word borrow there, okay? To borrow something is to what? To give it to them temporarily, but not transfer ownership. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if I borrow from you, then I still owe it to you, that I am going to eventually give it back to you, which means what? That it's still yours. And so the assumption here is that what? Is that you don't have to give something and not expect it back. You indeed, when you give someone and borrow and allow them to borrow, it's still yours to give and yours, it's owed back to you. So we have private property there. Then we have an interesting parable. A parable is a story of Jesus that Jesus would usually tell to illustrate an important principle in the kingdom of God. And one of the parables he tells is of this landowner that hires day workers to work in his field, a capitalist, someone who owns the capital and hires laborers. And the story goes like this. This man goes to the marketplace where the day workers would be waiting to get a job during the harvest, especially during the harvest. And he goes in the beginning of the day and he hires a bunch of workers, and he hires them at the set salary at that time, which is a denarius a day. And then he says, "Come work in my field, I'll pay you a denarius." And they say, "Okay." And they go. So that happens. They're working, and then in the middle of the day, he goes again. He didn't have enough work. So he goes again, and there's some who didn't get a job from anyone else. And he says, "Come in and I'll pay you a denarius." And so they go and they work. Now it's near the end of the day, and he still doesn't have enough workers. And so he goes at the end of the day, just a couple hours left in the workday, and he sees a couple that had just never gotten a job. And he says, "Come and work in my field, and I'll pay you um, I'll pay you something." He doesn't exactly tell them what he's going to pay them, and they come. And at the end of the day, the practice was that you got paid at the end of the day. So the master, the landowner, the capitalist goes, and from the very beginning to every single one of them, from the ones who began at the beginning of the day to the middle of the day to the end of the day, he gives each and every one of them the exact same amount of money, a denarius. And of course, the ones who had been working the whole day get upset. They're like, "Hey, we worked the whole day and we get the exact same amount as those who just worked a couple hours. That's not fair." And so the owner looks at them and says to them, "I paid you what we agreed, didn't I? I paid you a fair wage." And he goes on and says, "Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous?" Now, the key words in this passage is the word "is it not lawful." In the Greek, it means not just lawful, but morally permissible. And what is it morally permissible to do? To do what I want with what I own. And so here the assumption is in the parable is that it's morally okay to be a capitalist and to own a lot of land and have a lot of money, and and that in fact it's permissible for you to do with what you want as long as you don't violate justice, the assumption is, with your capital. And then he says something interesting. He says, "Or are you jealous because I am generous?" So the idea was those he paid at the end of the day, he wasn't dealing with them according to the standards of justice. He didn't have to pay them much at all because they didn't work the same amount. But instead, he gave them more than they deserved. In other words, he was generous. And that's the whole point of generosity, isn't it? Is that you not only give what you owe people, but you give more than you owe them. You give them over and above what you are required, which means what? That you must have ownership of it, and that you must have control of it, and that it must be permissible for you not to give. And that makes sense. Why would we praise someone for being generous when they're just simply giving what they owe? To be generous is to give more than what you owe, to give sacrificially. And you cannot give sacrificially what you don't own. And so that's the notion of love. That's what makes it admirable. That's what makes it something that when God does it to us, we see it as grace, something that's not only not deserved, but ill-merited is the theological phrase. So generosity requires that you own and that you give more than what you owe, which means you have permission. It is lawful for you to do with it what you want. You don't owe it to anybody. But not only does generosity require ownership, it requires this idea of it not being forced. Why is that important? Well, remember, communism, according to our definition, forces you to give up your private property, thereby making all giving ungenerous, unwilling, and therefore it makes impossible the biblical virtue of generosity. So this is the commandment that St. Paul gives to a church in Greece called Corinth. And again, let's read it. It says, "Each should give as he has chosen in his heart to give, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." Now, the context is this, is that the Roman world was experiencing a famine, and the poorer countries within and provinces within the Roman world were such that the famine was creating starvation. And so Paul was going to the richer areas of the church, and he was getting donations and to give to the poor saints in Jerusalem and in Palestine, which was a lot poorer. And he was going there to collect, and he wanted them to have a standard by which they could determine they themselves how much they would give. And this is the standard he gives them. The first is that they should give as they have chosen. Now, that word chosen in the Greek, proiresis, okay, is very important. It's actually used in Aristotle, and it's often translated in his ethics as not just choice, but as free choice. It's the difference between a voluntary action and a choice action. Voluntary action is just something you do give because you're willing, because you desire to do so. But something can be voluntary, but simply a matter of desire, and therefore a matter of raising, and therefore not something you had a choice in doing, because often impulse is not our choice. But Aristotle says, look, there's something where we could do other than what we do, and that requires rationality, it requires the ability to choose between selections, and that's the word proiresis, which means to decide beforehand between multiple choices. And so the idea he's saying is no one should give what because they're forced to under compulsion. They don't shouldn't feel like God is saying, look, you have to give. Rather, in order for this to truly be an act of giving and love, you have to have the ability to do otherwise and the moral permission not to give. Obviously, if a law forces you to give your property away, then it eliminates the possibility of true love, of true giving, of true generosity. Now, the objections have been raised to what I'm saying here, and it all comes from a couple passages in Acts. And this is the idea, first of all, that the Bible commands generosity, and it seems to, right? Didn't Jesus just say, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you? That seems to be a command and therefore make it a law, right? Well, that's because when we think like this, we just fail to distinguish between moral laws and political laws. Okay, there's a huge difference there. Okay, you might say, what do you mean? Aren't they both laws? Yeah, but a moral law tells you what you ought to do in the sense of what you ought to want to do. Okay, moral laws are what make you good. When you obey moral laws, you become a person who loves to do good. But if you're forced to do good, you're not good. If someone forces you to be generous, as we said, you're not generous. You are just giving grudgingly. And so the purpose of a moral law is to make you good. Hence, it cannot be forced. When God commands you to love, God isn't commanding you in the sense of you either love or else. He's saying this is what it means if you are truly a good person, uh, to be good, that you love and on your own and willingly do good. Okay. Whereas political laws are ones that by their very nature force you. I'll give you an example in the sense of health. You might even say that a lot of Christians, what they do is they argue um, that what moral laws are just the kinds of laws that are obeyed by reason rather than by force. For example, when my doctor tells me of you ought to avoid cholesterol, don't eat cholesterol. Obviously, the doctor isn't going to tell me if you don't, I'm going to kill you. That would kind of defeat the purpose, wouldn't it? If you eat any cholesterol, I'm going to kill you. No, his point is that if you eat cholesterol, these are the consequences. You're going to be unhealthy. So if you want to be healthy, if you want to be good, then you ought to be generous. But as we said, political laws are to prevent injustice. And hence, there's always the sword behind the political law. There's always the stick. that says that if you do not do this, then we are going to punish you. And so when the Bible commands generosity, it's not through political law. The political laws are meant to prevent injustice. They are meant to force you to give what you owe. But moral laws are meant to make you good, and therefore they're only just the rational guidelines of what it means to do so. And if you want to be good, then you will do it. If you do not want to be good, no one can force you to be good. And therefore, no one can force you to love. No one can force you to be generous. But again, we have this example in the book of the Acts, the earliest record of church history, that the church seemed to advocate or practice communism. We read, for example, in the second chapter in verse 44, all who had believed were together and had all things in common. Right? And then we have an even stronger statement in the fourth chapter, verse 32. Not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. And so this seems to be such that we had communism, right? Everybody, nobody owned their stuff. They all had it all in common, and whatever belonged to them, they sold it, and everybody treated it as public property. Isn't this communism? Well, again, it misunderstands the nature of this action of the early Christians, as if there was somehow a church law that forced them to do this. But there was a very instructive story in that early church that shows otherwise, okay? It is the story of a couple named Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira were early Christians. They lived in that community. They had a field, they had some private property, and they sold it. And then what they did is they took part of the money of the proceeds, and they put it at the feet of the apostles of Peter and said, "Oh, here's the money that we got for selling our field." And Peter asked them a very interesting question. He asked, "Is this all of it?" And Ananias says, "Yes, that's all the money we got for it. We're giving it all." Very interestingly enough, this is how Peter responds. He says, "Look, Ananias, while it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your control?" Okay. Now, the point here is that what? Is that Ananias didn't have to sell any of it. No one forced him. Before it was sold, it was yours, Ananias, Peter is saying. And after it was sold, that money was yours. The word control there is the word exousia in the Greek, and it just means legitimate authority. So Peter is fully admitting that Ananias and Sapphira didn't have to give any of the money or any of whatever. They could give whatever portion they wanted, and that as long as they didn't give it, it was theirs. Okay, they had authority over it, and that's what it means to own something, is that you have legitimate authority over it. So then what was their sin? Why then did Ananias and Sapphira get condemned for what they did? Well, the sin was for posing, not for possessing. Okay, this is really important. They lied. Ananias and Sapphira lied because they wanted to be seen as sacrificial, that they had, like everyone else, they wanted to be like the other Christians. They had given everything to help the church and those who were poor and needy. And their sin wasn't that they owned anything and that they didn't give it over. It was that they lied and tried to pretend they were generous when they weren't. So, in summary, Christianity and communism can't go together. Why? Because it prevents the two central moral virtues in Christianity. The basic one, justice, is prevented because stealing requires private property. And the Bible fully admits not only that you can possess and own things that are consumables, but also things that are capital. In fact, it assumes it in the very commandments of not coveting and not stealing. And we see that Jesus assumes it in his parables and in the notion of borrowing and in the notion of what you can do with your land and your money. But more so, in the Christian idea, the central virtue is love, which means to give above and beyond, to be generous with your possessions. And that assumes that you own those possessions and that you give willingly and that you are not forced to do so. But any communist system must force you to give all that you own and therefore eliminate any possibility of generosity. So we are now done with this particular video on capitalism, on communism and Christianity. And in our next video, we are going to see now also that not only is Christianity not compatible with communism, but surprisingly enough, it is not compatible with the modern versions of capitalism. We'll see you then.